What if the voice that rescued Chicago from collapse was the same voice that destroyed them? Peter Cetera sang with his jaw wired shut to make one of their biggest records. Then Jimi Hendrix called their guitarist the greatest he'd ever heard. And that guitarist died pulling a trigger on an empty magazine that wasn't empty. When Cetera finally walked, they sent a letter instead of making a call. This is the Peter Cetera problem Chicago couldn't survive. It was the mid-1980s, and Chicago was back on top of the world. Their album Chicago 17 had gone quadruple platinum. Their singles dominated adult contemporary radio. Their music videos played in constant rotation on MTV. By every commercial measure, they had completed one of the most remarkable comebacks in rock history. But inside the band, something was breaking. Peter Cetera, the man whose soaring tenor had delivered those massive hits, was exhausted. He had been on the road for years. He had a young family at home. He wanted breathing room, a chance to record solo material, to step back from the relentless cycle of touring and recording that had defined his entire adult life. He asked the band for flexibility. He pointed to Phil Collins, who managed solo work alongside Genesis without destroying either career. It seemed like a reasonable request. The band saw it differently. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. What arrived in Cetera's mailbox was not a compromise. It was an ultimatum, a letter demanding his commitment to another album and another full tour. At the bottom of that letter was a warning that pulled no punches. If he refused, they would look elsewhere. Cetera looked at that letter for a long time. Then, he walked away. In an instant, the voice behind Hard to Say I'm Sorry, You're the Inspiration, and Stay the Night was gone. The man who had become the face of Chicago, whose image had dominated their music videos, whose voice had carried their most beloved songs, had packed up and left. The band kept going, but the question of whether they were truly Chicago anymore was one nobody could answer. The real story, though, started long before that letter ever arrived. To understand what Chicago lost the day Peter Cetera walked out, you have to go back to the very beginning, back to a Chicago, Illinois rehearsal room in 1967, where 7 young musicians were building something the music world had never seen before. They called themselves The Big Thing at first. 7 members, 3 horns, electric guitar, bass, keyboards, and drums. From the start, they operated as a collective, a democracy where every member had an equal vote and every dollar earned was split 7 ways down the middle. Their manager and producer James William Guercio relocated them to Los Angeles and rechristened them the Chicago Transit Authority. The name was shortened to Chicago in 1969 when the city threatened legal action, but the spirit stayed the same, raw, ambitious, unwilling to compromise. What made early Chicago dangerous was the chemistry between 3 very different voices and personalities. Robert Lamb was the intellectual, the keyboard player and primary songwriter, whose lyrics carried genuine political weight. Terry Kath was the soul of the band, a guitarist so gifted that Jimi Hendrix himself reportedly told him, "That's the best guitar player I've heard. He's better than me." And Peter Cetera was the young bass player, with the high, clean tenor, a precise finger-style player whose voice cut through the brass like a bell. None of these 3 men were the star. That was the whole point. Chicago's debut double album landed in 1969, and the music world paid attention immediately. 12 tracks blending rock grit with jazz improvisation and horn arrangements that felt more like a soul orchestra than a rock band. Their early albums were numbered rather than titled, a deliberate artistic statement. They were a collective, making statements, not a star-making machine. The early years were defined by raw defiance. When a club owner demanded they play soft cover songs for slow dancing, Terry Kath led the band into a blistering Frank Zappa cover instead. They were fired on the spot. On the ride home, Kath drew the lesson that would define their early career. If they were going to make it, they had to write their own songs and control their own set lists. That defiance produced some of the era's most respected rock music. 25 or 6 to 4. Does anybody really know what time it is? Saturday in the Park. Songs with horn arrangements that hit like freight trains, bass lines that locked in with surgical precision, and vocals shared equally among 3 men who never competed for the spotlight. The story of Cetera's jaw is worth telling here. During this period, Cetera was badly injured in a fight at Dodger Stadium and suffered a broken jaw that was wired shut for a time. He still had to work through the limitations of that injury while the band kept moving forward. That was early Chicago. Not a soft rock band, not a ballad machine, a group of 7 men with something to prove, driven by equal parts musical ambition and sheer stubborn will. Peter Cetera was just one voice in that machine. Nobody could have predicted what he was about to become. January 23rd, 1978. A house party in the Hollywood Hills. Terry Kath had been awake for days. The band's road manager Don Johnson watched as Kath cleaned a semi-automatic pistol at the end of a long night. Johnson told him to be careful. Kath pulled out the magazine, showed Johnson it was empty, and smiled. What neither of them knew was that a single round remained chambered. "What do you think I'm going to do? Blow my brains out?" He pulled the trigger. He was 31 years old. He left behind a wife, a 2-year-old daughter, and a band that would never fully recover. The death of Terry Kath didn't just devastate Chicago, it removed the gravitational center of the band. Kath had been the fire, the unpredictable, improvisational guitar force that gave the band its edge and its danger. He was the one member whose personality and talent were impossible to replicate. Without him, Chicago felt unmoored in a way that no new guitarist could fix. They nearly didn't survive it. The band members were so shattered that serious conversations happened about whether Chicago should simply stop. But the band that continued was not the same band. The late 1970s albums struggled. The records failed to connect with a rock audience that was fragmenting in the post-disco, punk-rattled landscape. Chicago drifted. The songwriting suffered. The members who weren't Cetera or Lamb had been leaning hard on substances, and the creative output reflected it. When Peter Cetera looked back on that period years later, he was blunt. The songwriting efforts being brought to sessions during that stretch were, in his own words, pure garbage. Then came David Foster. Drummer Danny Seraphine pushed hard to bring Foster in as producer in 1982. Foster was a commercial hitmaker, a polished architect of adult contemporary radio who understood exactly what the charts wanted. He heard Chicago's catalog, assessed the talent, and arrived at a very clear conclusion. Peter Cetera's voice was the commercial engine the band had been sitting on. Foster began reshaping Chicago from the inside. The jazz rock experimentation that had defined the band's early albums was quietly retired. In its place came synthesizers, lush string arrangements, and songs built specifically to showcase that high, clean Cetera tenor. The horns, once the band's defining sonic identity, were pushed further and further into the background. It worked commercially. The 1982 album Chicago 16 gave the band their first top 10 hit in years with Hard to Say I'm Sorry. The formula was validated, and so Foster leaned further into it, and the band followed. What nobody said out loud, what nobody wanted to confront, was the cost. 7 equals had walked into the 1970s as a democracy. By the time Foster finished reordering the architecture, Chicago had a face, a voice, and a star. And that star increasingly understood his own value. It's hard for me to say I'm sorry. The seeds of what was coming had been planted. It would take a few more years for anyone to reckon with the harvest. Chicago 17 arrived in the spring of 1984, and it exploded. The album went quadruple platinum. 4 singles cracked the top 10. Stay the Night, Hard Habit to Break, You're the Inspiration, Along Comes a Woman. Every one of them helped define the album's massive commercial run. Every music video featured Peter Cetera prominently. Every radio programmer in America knew exactly who Chicago was. And that name had a face now. One face, not 7. For the fans, it felt like triumph. For the other members of Chicago, it was quietly devastating. The horn players, the men whose instrument had literally defined the band's identity since 1967, found themselves increasingly sidelined. In the recording studio, the horn arrangements that had once been the backbone of the music were trimmed, simplified, or in some cases replaced entirely by synthesizers. In the music videos that MTV demanded, the brass players stood in the background while Cetera commanded the screen. James Pankow, Lee Loughnane, and Walter Parazater had built this band from nothing. Now they were background props in their own story. Robert Lamb, the band's original songwriting voice, felt the displacement too. The model that Foster had engineered put Cetera and Foster at the creative center, with everyone else contributing far less than they once had. Lamb later said that this was not what he had signed up for, that Chicago had become something he barely recognized. But Cetera's perspective was equally legitimate, and the broader picture makes that clear. He was doing the majority of the writing and the majority of the singing. He was the face on the videos, the voice on the singles, the reason the phones rang at radio stations, and still, the royalties were split 7 ways. Still, the decision-making required consensus among men who resented his visibility while depending on it financially. Cetera wanted what Phil Collins had negotiated with Genesis, the freedom to pursue solo work during band hiatuses without being forced to choose between his career and his family. He had a young daughter. He was physically exhausted. He asked the band to bend. They didn't. The ultimatum that arrived in his mailbox was clear. Record another album. Commit to another full tour, or we look elsewhere. Cetera sat with that letter and made a decision that would define both his life and theirs for the next 4 decades. Was I fired or did I quit? He reflected years later. I think it was both. They had backed me into a corner and gave me only a little doorway to get out, which I decided to take. Drummer Danny Seraphine, who had championed the Foster era that made Cetera indispensable, later admitted in his memoir that both sides bore responsibility. I believe the 2 sides could have worked it out, but ego got in the way. Communication broke down, and the deal didn't get done. Nobody fully won, but everybody lost. Voice was walking out the door, and Chicago was about to find out just how dependent they had become on the one thing they refused to share. Chicago moved fast. Within weeks of Cetera's departure in mid-1985, the band auditioned a 23-year-old singer and bassist named Jason Scheff. His credentials were striking. He was the son of Jerry Scheff, the legendary bass player who had played behind Elvis Presley. His vocal range was impressive. His energy was high. He learned the catalog quickly and stepped into one of the most high-profile frontman vacancies in rock history. But he was not Peter Cetera, and everyone in America knew it. Chicago 18, the first album recorded without Cetera, produced the hit Will You Still Love Me, and the record performed respectably. Then, Chicago 19, released in 1988, delivered something that defied expectations entirely. The ballad Look Away reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and stayed there for 2 weeks, making it the band's biggest charting single ever. On the surface, this looked like proof that Chicago could survive the split, and in a narrow commercial sense, it was. But the story underneath was more complicated. Listeners in the late 1980s found themselves hearing 2 versions of the same commercial instinct. Peter Cetera's solo career was moving at full speed. His single Glory of Love, from the Karate Kid Part 2 film, had been a massive #1 hit in 1986, and his duet with Amy Grant, The Next Time I Fall, had also gone to #1 the same year. Both artists were now competing for the same adult contemporary radio audience. Fans bought Chicago records and heard a voice that wasn't quite Cetera's. Then they bought Cetera records and heard something that sounded almost like a Chicago ballad. The 2 entities were chasing each other in circles, blurring the commercial identity of both. Robert Lamb captured the internal strain with painful honesty. He made it clear that he was not happy with how things were going, that the label was increasingly leaning on outside musicians and outside songwriters, and that Chicago had become a more faceless commercial operation than the one he had signed up for. There was also a darker dimension to the split that fans never saw. Some reporting and later commentary suggest that Cetera's solo work may not have received the same promotional push from the record label that they gave to Chicago, though the exact reasons are hard to separate from broader business politics and timing. Even with 2 consecutive #1 singles, his album Solitude/Solitaire appears to have received less visible support than expected. Cetera never returned to the band. Chicago survived. They sold records. They filled venues. But the version of Chicago that had once been described as the best guitar player's backing band, the jazz rock democracy that had set the terms of American rock on their own, was gone. What remained was commercially successful and emotionally hollow. And the question of what Chicago actually was would haunt them for decades to come. The decades after the split told two parallel stories that never quite intersected. Peter Cetera built a solo career defined by massive soundtrack moments. He worked on his own terms, in his own time, with no democratic vote required and no touring schedule dictated by 6 other men. For Cetera, leaving had been the right decision. He never expressed regret about it publicly. Chicago, meanwhile, transformed into a legacy touring act of remarkable durability. They continued recording through lineup changes, kept the horn section that had defined them, and found audiences who showed up summer after summer for the catalog. The songs from the early 1970s, the power ballads from the Foster era, the hits that had played at 1,000 proms and 100,000 summer road trips across America. In 2016, the music industry finally granted Chicago the recognition long overdue. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It should have been a moment of complete triumph, a celebration of a band that had sold more than 100 million records and spent nearly 5 decades creating music that mattered to millions of people. Instead, it became the final act of a drama that had been running for 30 years. Negotiations for a reunion performance at the ceremony fell apart over a musical dispute. Reporting at the time indicated that Cetera was not comfortable with the proposed arrangement for performing 25 or 6/4, and the band did not want to alter it to suit his vocal range. The exact musical details were part of the disagreement, but the larger issue was the same one that had followed them for decades. Nobody could find a version of compromise that felt good enough to both sides. Cetera declined to attend the induction ceremony entirely. While his former bandmates were honored on one of music's most prestigious stages, he spent the evening watching a hockey game. When asked about the possibility of ever sharing a stage with Chicago again, Cetera gave an answer that closed every door at once. He had no desire, he said, to reintroduce the negativity, the misplaced egos, and the petty jealousies he had left behind. Music is supposed to be fun, he said, and there's no way that was going to be fun. The Peter Cetera problem was never really about one man's voice or one band's unwillingness to compromise. It was about what happens when a democratic institution becomes dependent on a singular talent. When the collective can no longer function without the individual, it refuses to fully recognize. His voice gave Chicago a second life, but it came at the cost of the first one. And for a band built on the principle that no one man was bigger than the whole, that turned out to be a price they could never stop paying. Chicago proved that a band built on democracy can be undone by its own success. They gave the world some of the greatest horn-driven rock and roll ever recorded, then reinvented themselves as the voice of a generation's slow dances and heartbreaks. But the machine that saved them also broke them. What's your memory of Chicago, the dangerous jazz rock band of the 70s, or the ballad kings of the 80s? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories from rock's greatest era.